I think we'll go ahead and get started on this session, and hopefully people will dribble back in as we go. I'd like to welcome you to the Outer Lines session on the business of pro cycling. My name is Steve Maxwell with my colleague Joe down at the end of the table here. We are the editors of the Outer Line, which is a website and a blog which features governance and economic analysis and writing around the sport of pro cycling. And so we're happy to have the opportunity to have a group of experts here this morning to talk to us about several different aspects of the business side of pro cycling. You know, relative to the sports that we have discussed at this conference in general, cycling faces many of the same issues, many of the same challenges, but it also has some unique aspects. It is really one of the only sports, major sports, that's actually played out on the road, and so we don't have, in comparison to other sports, we don't have the options of revenue generation that many sports where you play the sport in a stadium or in an arena have. And so we have a built-in sort of economic challenge to the sport. This has led to near total reliance for the economics of the sport on sponsorship model. And that has in turn led to a sort of an economic uncertainty which permeates the sport and which always has kind of led to a short-term or survivalist type of thinking oftentimes in the sport, which has in turn led to some of the cutting of corners and so forth that we've seen that's characterized the sport historically. The sport has been tarred as the sort of whipping boy of the doping issues of the last 20 or 30 years, even though I think the sport today can justifiably claim that we have done more than most sports to try to address and monitor and correct the problem of doping. The sport is also subject to a sort of a fractured, or some would say sort of feudal management style. We have a number of different stakeholders in this sport, each pulling and tugging on each other to try to get their way in the sport. We have a group of race organizers. We have a group of teams associations. We have a relatively weak union student rider association, which we'll be hearing about in a few minutes. And finally, we have the UCI, with the International Federation, which oversees the sport and which has often taken on perhaps a bit broader or more controversial role in the overall sport than in the case of many other sports. So we have a number of issues or challenges facing the sport which are a bit different perhaps than some of the other games that we're here to talk about in the conference. But we try to focus not just on these challenges, but on the opportunities that they present. Wherever there are challenges, there are obviously opportunities. And I think those of us with a more of a forward-looking perspective on this sport see great opportunities to continue to grow, make the sport more accessible to a wider range of people, and hopefully grow the sport overall. So this morning, we have a group of experts here, which I will introduce individually as they make their presentations. I would, however, like to call special attention to Mr. Brian Cookson, immediate past president of the UCI, the International Federation, formerly the head of British Cycling, and we're very pleased to have Brian with us today to make some comments following these individual speeches and to provide us with his perspective on where the sport is today and some of the opportunities we face in the future. So let me have the first presentation, if you would, which I will just kick off. We have with us, who I'll introduce in just a second, a couple of officials from Rapha, the British cycling apparel, direct-to-customer apparel company based in London. And our first topic today is to talk about what is the appropriate role of vendors or suppliers in the governance of sports. What role should these types of companies play? And obviously there is an opportunity for these types of companies to play a very important role to help not only provide the equipment and the supplies that are needed to enhance the sport, but also to get involved in the economics or the governance of the sport. And the question really is what is the proper role? How do we best maintain the control or an oversight, and how can we provide incentive for more activist or more involved vendors and suppliers to play a positive role in the sport? The key aspect here is how to control the companies from playing too much of a role or exerting too much influence over the sport. And we have a few examples in the past, as we see here on the slide. For example, the involvement of Nike, obviously one of the most involved sponsors around the world of sports, and the role it's had in improving the popularity of the NBA in the United States and around the world. Perhaps a counterexample to that was their involvement in the co-branding of Lance Armstrong's Livestrong project, and what happened to that after the exposure and downfall of Lance Armstrong. Finally, we have the Breaking 2 project, which has proven to be a major support in the field of elite running. So there are some good and some more questionable examples of what role vendors can play in the sport. So what I would like to do now is invite my two colleagues here. James Fairbank is the head of brand for Rapha, and his colleague Oliver Duggan is also with us today, who is the head of copy for the company, and they're going to be talking about a specific project that they have undertaken in terms of getting more involved in trying to help promote good governance in the sport of cycling. James?
Thank you very much, Steve. Good morning, everybody. So thank you for the kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak here today. To provide a little bit more context onto who we are and why we're here talking about a project related to sports governance. So as Steve mentioned, Rapha is a leading international cycling apparel manufacturer and lifestyle brand based in London. We were founded in 2004. And we are now 450 employees worldwide with 20 physical store locations and a turnover this year that will hit something around in the region of about 80 million sterling. So we actually have a goal which drives our business that goes beyond being successful financially. So our business was set up and founded to try and help make road cycling the most popular sport in the world. That was the insight that drove the business itself, and we spend our time marketing the sport and the pursuit rather than trying to kind of market specific products. On the understanding that effectively a rising tide raises all boats. If we improve the sport, then so that improves the market for everybody. We also recognise that the professional side of the sport is chaotic in terms of its governance, and although it is incredible and there's a huge amount of personal commitment and ambition that's channeled through every aspect of it, from the riders through to the organisers, it's also quite antiquated in terms of the way that it's set up. And we feel that for the sport to be truly relevant to a modern audience, then there are a number of changes it should consider to help evolve. So given the complexity of the sport of professional cycling, we felt it was necessary to research the field, which is where Steve and Joe, the outer lineman, and an academic called Daan van Rieth came in, because we wanted to provide a foundation for a number of suggestions we were going to make on how the sport could evolve. So it goes without saying that modern sport is undergoing a series of fundamental changes. In a broad sense, everything's moving around, so from media to the audience to the emergence of over-the-top. And if cycling doesn't engage with these changes, it's in danger of becoming less interesting and even irrelevant to a modern audience. And that obviously, from our business perspective and our ambition, is something which would affect us profoundly. So we know that the economic and governance challenges facing pro cycling are not well understood outside a small group of industry insiders. And in truth, it doesn't really matter for the fans of the sport. They really want to see something which is easy to understand and exciting. But at the same time, what provides something that's easy to understand and exciting is based on a foundation of extremely good governance. So we decided to address this challenge by drafting an overview of the challenges and opportunities facing the sport in collaboration with Steve, Joe and Daan from the University of Leuven. We then took this initial draft and went to about 50 individuals, from Brian through to the head of the ASO, through to journalists and professional riders, for their perspective on the work that we've produced. And my colleague Ollie, who's been leading those interviews, is now writing those into what we're calling the Rafa roadmap, which is an overview of the sport as it currently stands. Ollie will now take you through the stage that we've currently reached and the next steps before we publish early next year.
Thanks, James. I just want to echo your thanks as well, Steve, for the introduction and for having us. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are, where we've got to, and what comes next, the current status of the project. So we're preparing to publish the research. It's going to run to a fairly weighty 30,000 words or so by the time we publish it, illustrated with infographics, with the interviews written into it, panelled out, like a pretty chunky piece of work. And the way that we've got there is we've gone away and done this research with Steve and Joe and Dharm, gone through a series of edits and then a series of interviews up to around 50 now, and we've got a few more still to do. And then we'll write those interviews back into the work and publish this research. There's a note on the interviews, which is that there are obvious limitations in that there's loads of people, hundreds of people that we could speak to, that we want to speak to, that it's simply logistically difficult to. And the idea is that once we publish this, will continue to be a living, breathing piece of research that helps frame a debate within the sport, and we'll continue to do those interviews to inform how we work and how we think the sport could evolve. The next steps are basically what does it mean for Rapha and what does it mean for the wider sports. For Rapha, it's really informing our business priorities, so it's given a real clarity to what we think we should be doing over the next 5 years, specifically in terms of engagement with new audiences, with new riders and with the professional sport, how we approach the professional sport moving forward. But also beyond that, our ambition for the work is to trigger a debate, a discussion that can involve anyone from like the first fan to the most invested stakeholder, and allow them to communicate in some open public forum. And that may be a consultation, it may be some sort of media series that gets feedback, but the idea is that we continue to keep this document moving and keep it alive, because as we look around in the sport now, it's very hard to see where that exists. You have to be quite deep, you have to be quite wonkish in the sport to try and find that, and there's an opportunity there to host that discussion. So there'll therefore be a continuous feedback loop in the work that brings new thoughts and new arguments in. The way that it'll be structured is that it looks at really 5 main areas of professional cycling. It looks at its governance and organisation, the format of the sport itself and the calendar of the World Tour, the management of teams and athletes and their progression through the sport, the work of media and broadcast rights around events, and the broader revenue and economic drivers within the sport. And for each of those areas, what we have done is we've looked at what are the arguments surfacing within the interviews and the research that's already been done, what are the principles that should be laid out for any reform in those areas, what are the recommendations for how that reform goes about, and then ultimately, and most excitingly for us, what are the commitments that we can make as a business that can help to start to see that happen? What can we go away within our relatively small world within the sport and start to do that shows that actually there is a different way to govern the sport, there's a different way to organise and format it. So when it comes to being published, it'll be published in 3 formats. There'll be the long form version, which I expect everybody in this room to read, the full 30,000 words. There'll also be a much shorter version, which is infographic led and is a kind of guide to what's in there, and then a super short 1-pager, because we're aware that that's 30,000 words is quite a high barrier to entry, and wherever possible we want to make it more accessible and easier to be informed. So what does it say? In very general terms, without wanting to give everything away, it obviously says that the professional sport needs to be more exciting, it needs to be more engaging, and in each of those areas it looks root and branch at what reforms could be proposed, with the ultimate aim of connecting the professional side of the sport to more people in a more meaningful way. If we can do that in one area, if we can do that in 2 areas, if we can do that anywhere, that's ultimately going to be success for us. It also looks at a more strategic level at what pro cycling can do as a driver for participation, aware that there are other participatory barriers to cycling that are actually higher than in most other sports, but there is something that pro cycling can do as a driver for participation, and what in each of these areas could that be? And as James mentioned, how if we grow the pie itself, there'll be more for everybody, the economics of the sport will improve. So it's more than a year's work by the time it's published. It's born out of this fundamental goal for us to grow the sport, to make road cycling the most popular sport in the world. And it's a really big chance to stimulate a critical debate as to how we move forward. It seems like there's a tipping point, and this is the moment to be doing it. And ultimately, it's a blueprint for growth for Rapha, but more broadly for the sport itself. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, James, Ollie. Just to sort of wrap this up, I think that the question behind this project and this ongoing study is to is to really delve into this question of, can a vendor kind of do well by doing good? Can a vendor responsibly help to promote better governance, greater growth, greater visibility of a sport for the good of all and for the participation of all, while also obviously enlarging the market to which they're selling their own products. So we hope that this will be an example of that sort of old sage of doing well by doing good. Obviously, the issue is in, as we said at the outset, is in, how do you control and make sure that that vendor stays within the proper guidelines. So thank you, James and Ollie, for your contribution. Next, we will turn to the issue of journalism in cycling, what role responsible journalism can play in properly presenting the sport, but also in helping to grow the sport and make it more visible, more accessible to a wider number of people. And in this regard, we have with us this morning two very senior and experienced journalists. Raymond Kerckhoffs is with the Telegraaf paper here in Holland and has been a sports writer and followed, I think, some 28 different Tours de France. So a very experienced journalist in the cycling field, and is currently serving as, and has for several years, served as the head of the International Association of Cycling Journalists. Presenting with Raymond will be Stephen Farrand, again a very experienced cycling reporter who has worked for a number of the different cycling publications in Europe over the past 25 years, currently working with Cyclingnews. So with that, I'd like to welcome Raymond and Stephen.
Good morning, everybody. I will first explain what the AIJC is. It's the Association of International Cycling Journalists. We have more than 300 professional members from 33 countries. Our main goal is to improve the working conditions for the journalists during the biggest cycling races of the year. One of the things we tried to really achieve was to make a working group with the press officers of the big races and the press officers of the teams. But after 4 years, we tried always to come together, but it didn't work out. And that is maybe one of the main problems that cycling has, that everybody is only looking to his own business and not looking to the global things, how we can achieve together some things.
Yeah, obviously, cycling has several stakeholders, the people who control the sport, are involved in the sport directly. Perhaps cycling, we don't consider ourselves a stakeholder, but we consider ourselves a key member of the family, I think. So, but obviously, we've got our own challenges. We see that the challenges to the media, our own business pressures, television and press and newsprint is under constant pressure since the rise of digital media. We've all got lower budgets, lower advertising income, and we're all trying to find our own future. Obviously, the media's been shifting from magazines and newspapers to websites. And then one of the biggest issues the last 20 years has been the years and the series of big doping scandals, which have created distrust between the media and the teams and the riders, and vice versa. We're worried of what they do, and they're worried of how we report them in the public domain. Obviously, social media is having a bigger and bigger impact in lots of ways, fake news, how teams go direct, how people consume their news. So the stories, the big stories of cycling, the beautiful stories of cycling that we see out there, we want to report, it's becoming more and more difficult to report those stories. And so that's damaging the media, which in turn is damaging the sport of cycling, we believe.
The last years we see that pro cycling bypasses the media. Teams and race organizers have developed their own digital marketing and media structures and pushing propaganda to fans to bypass the traditional media. The teams only bring positive news, often not the real stories which happens in races, and that are just the stories that the big audience want to hear. Teams are now also restricting the media access to riders to try to control the narrative. Riders' quotes are often the same. When a rider has won, you see in every press release, thanks to the team, I could win. If you see, we as journalists, we were invited to races like the Tour Down Under, the Tour of Dubai, or the Grand Prix Montreal. The race organizer pays all the costs for us, and then we arrive, and the teams say, no, it's not possible to have big interviews with the top riders. Also, a rider like Chris Froome, when he was wearing the yellow jersey at the rest days of the Tour de France, he refused to give a press conference because he said, rest day is not a media day. So, and only on the channels of Sky, you saw it was possible to get some quotes from Chris Froome. Teams, races, organizers, and their sponsors use self-branded websites, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube channels, and PR professionals to put a positive spin on everything they do and to neutralize any scandals. If you look to Team Sky, the rumors are that they only have a budget of €450,000 a year to do their PR stuff for press releases and everything else. The end of this results that this reduces the narrative of the sports insiders selling to insiders. Teams and race organizers are telling and selling cycling stories to existing fans without the outreach to hook new fans and expand the base of interest.
You can see from the graphic what that means. For me, I work for Cyclingnews. That's a fan site. People who read Cyclingnews are well informed. They understand the sport. But the bigger question is, how do we attract new fans, new consumers? How do we make the sport bigger for us, for the media, but also for the sponsors and the teams? But at the moment, we're just hitting this wall. And in many ways, it's getting worse. You know, the less access to the media means that to the riders that we can't report those great stories. So the sports outreach is getting, is getting less and less. Obviously, TV plays a big part. Media is probably a small part compared to the visibility that TV gives to sponsors' brands. But even TV is going down that narrow road. You know, we've got pay-to-view exclusive deals, which are limiting the outreach of the sport. It's happened to other sports, perhaps tennis in the past, but that's not the best way to go for cycling. We've seen with Eurosport that they paid race organizers sport more to get the exclusive Giro d'Italia rights in several countries, including the Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark, which are big cycling nations. It increased its subscriber base, but it meant the overall viewership of the race, the visibility of the Giro d'Italia and all those team sponsors was actually down by 25%. And also, obviously, as we mentioned before, team sponsors are choosing alternative digital marketing strategies to get their brands across and get their brand visibility.
Yeah, you see, for many teams, they don't understand at this point that maybe their biggest rival is Google and Facebook. I spoke a couple of months ago with one of the owners of Vacances Soleil. For 5 years, they were sponsor of a big team, 3 years title sponsor of a World Tour team. And I asked them, what are you now doing with all the budget which you gave for several years on cycling? And he said, everything is now going to Google search, because then we have campings, we know directly that we can find our clients, and with sponsoring a cycling team, we only could show our brand and not reach directly our supposed clients. For the future, the media can be very important to help draw new fans. Good journalism is not dead. Recent global events have proved of that. I give an example. If you see what happened with the New York Times since Donald Trump became president, the good journalism of the New York Times journalists increased in an incredible way how much readers were following the New York Times. The media has to adapt to the changes in the digital technology and consumer trends. Also, the media has to create its own sustainable business model that does not depend on simple digital advertising and social media links, perhaps subscribers model, and with other income sources it's possible. I think that the media can create a very positive feedback loop with good journalism, so with good interview, with specific details of races, romantic stories which teams and organizers will not bring, with a really true story, to build stronger relationships with the current fans and share the sport with a new global audience. I think on this way, the media also can help the economics of the sports. They can generate publicity, but they also have the possibility to generate a new public for cycling.
With the graphic, we can see perhaps how we can create this positive feedback. Raymond writes for the Telegraaf, which is not an insider's media. His stories, his interviews with Tom Dumoulin or with Chris Froome reach a wider audience, a new audience. So we've got to break the barrier and reach across towards the general public. But we've got to do it right. You know, the ethics have got to be in place, the business model's got to be in place, so that when we have a great story, when we have a great athlete like Tom Dumoulin, or perhaps the next Lance Armstrong, it's done right, and we have a good legacy. We don't need another Lance Armstrong hangover.
What is our proposal? To create a media hub or working group for professional cycling. Today, each stakeholder in cycling is on its own, is only partially effective at promoting its interests. We propose the creation of a dedicated media hub or working group to help promote and report professional cycling for the benefits of all stakeholders. We as journalists have the experience and also the knowledge how to reach a big audience. We sell the sport to the world, and that's something the other stakeholders have to realize. The UCI, the race organizers, the broadcasters, the media representatives, and the teams and riders each have a share in this media hub and working group.
That's how the department or the media hub could look. But at the moment, we have all those different groups, but they don't include the media in the strategy or how they talk about the future. We're seen perhaps on the outside. We think we can play a central role in the middle for everybody as a hub. That's it.
Oh, wait, the last.
Yeah, we were missing a slide. You said.
Yeah.
Obviously, the media created the Tour de France over 100 years ago to sell more newspapers. So we believe that the sport needs to understand now how the media can help improve the economics and future success of professional cycling. We think we need to be involved. I think we can make a difference as well.
So I think the strong has to be that in cycling all the parties have to work more together, and also that the media is one part of that. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Raymond, Stephen. One of the primary topics that we've heard addressed at this conference and at many similar conferences is the voice of the athletes themselves, the rights of the athletes in the oversight and the governance and the direction, strategy in the sport. And I think it's quite clear from looking at some of the more major and larger sports that they have only grown to the levels they have, like some of the major American sports, once the athletes had a formal union or a formal voice and a formal way in which to make their opinions known. Cycling does have a small union. It's called the CPA. It's been in place for 15 or so plus years, but it's generally viewed as a fairly weak organization without a lot of influence on the sport. Our next speaker, Michael Carcaise, was one of the architects of the founding of the Association of North American Professional Road Cyclists, an organization which supports North American pro-level, World Tour level riders. And Michael has also had an outsized influence on the CPA and the overall direction of the General Riders Union. And he's going to talk to us today about the role of stronger athletes' voice in the direction of the sport longer term. Michael?
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon. I'm Michael Carcaise, Executive Director of the North American chapter of the CPA. CPA, as Steve mentioned, it is the independent international association that represents the pro riders. It's about 750 professional cyclists who are employed by the top 2 divisions of men's teams. First of all, thanks to Play the Game and Outer Line for the invitation to join the panel. I look forward to the discussion. I had thought a lot about focusing on the internals of the CPA, but when the news broke that former President Brian Cookson was going to be here, I thought it might be a little bit more interesting to focus on the UCI itself and where athlete representation fits in today and where it might go in the future. In America, we have a phrase that is sometimes used when a person is too focused on the pains of process and not on outcomes and results. And in this case, we say, don't tell me about the labor, just show me the baby. But today I'm going to talk to you about the labor pains. And because this is a conference, unlike most, that embraces the mechanics of sport governance, I want to focus on just a few of the details of the governance inside the UCI, where I'm here to report today that athletes are underrepresented. I view the present dissatisfaction with the economics of cycling and the repeated efforts to reform. It's an opportunity for athletes to advance their own interests on key issues in addition to economics, including protection of their personal data, improved health and safety during their careers, and at the end of their racing career, a meaningful series of payments, financial payments, that support them in the transition and training to their next job. But more fundamentally, professional athletes, they want and they deserve an equal say on the issues that affect them and their careers. They deserve to be represented by legitimate, independent organizations of their own choosing, not just athletes' commissions created and managed by their governing bodies. As Steve mentioned, it's been shown in other major sports that with a well-developed, a well-established and active and dynamic players association, athletes become more effective in the governance of their own sport. The sport evolves in a more positive, healthy, and economically successful way. So I want to show the deficit with a couple of slides and a brief examination of the composition of 3 UCI committees. 1, the Management Committee, 2, the Pro Cycling Council, and 3, the existing UCI Athletes Commission, and how that lack of athlete participation has affected some recent decisions for pro cycling. First, though, a review of some of the main stakeholders of pro cycling, their primary activities and their relative size. Steve touched on this, but I want to make sure I express the fractured nature of the landscape today. You've got the UCI, and below that are its various departments. It's important to remember that it's not just road cycling. They do have 9 different disciplines, though on a next slide you'll see the relative size of those disciplines. There's the AIJCP, which is the Teams Association, and this is the top level of professional teams. That's the top 2 divisions, and it's a pretty wide spectrum of interests that you have between all those members. There's approximately 40 of them. The number changes depending year to year on the number in the second division, which fluctuates. Then there's the AOC, that is the Association of Race Owners and Organizers, and their members include the ASO, which owns the Tour de France and Paris-Nice and Paris-Roubaix, among other races. And finally, the 4th stakeholder is the CPA, which I show here its constituent parts labeled by nations because the CPA is actually an umbrella organization for national associations. Our chapter, North American chapter, is the first new member in its history, formed a couple of years ago, and it's the first to represent riders from 2 nations. So we're the first supranational association. Among many activities, the UCI, it writes the rules and regulations, they manage the calendar of competitions, they issue licenses to the races, they issue licenses to the teams, which makes them eligible to compete in those races, and they administer discipline for violations of rules, for example. The race organizers, they own and operate the events, and importantly, they hold and they exploit the broadcast rights for their events. The teams, it's important to know that they operate primarily funded by money they collect from their own sponsors. All other sources of income are practically negligible. It's completely a sponsor revenue model. So here's a breakdown of the UCI's annual income, and I'll just draw your attention quickly to 2 data points from this slide before we dig into the composition of UCI committees. One, the chart on the left side shows UCI revenue divided by discipline, and you can see here road cycling as measured by revenue into the UCI is bigger than the other 8 disciplines combined. Now, a large portion of this income is derived from host fees for the UCI's annual Road World Championships. So the AOC and the independent event organizers, they own all those other races. The UCI's biggest event is the Road World Championships. And that's shown on the table on the right side, which is line item there as hosting fees. Finally, take note of the UCI's total revenue, 67 million Swiss francs. Compare that to one of the stakeholders that the UCI is tasked with regulating, for example, the teams. Now, they are fractured, but if you view them as a single entity, the combined budgets of just the 18 top-level teams, just the World Tour, Division 1, that combined budget exceeds 350 million euros. And there are efforts for teams to cooperate in more of a joint business venture way. And you could see the potential for that. I mean, if they really did unite, they'd instantly become a much larger entity than the regulator. In the interest of time, I'll skip ahead to meet my time limit and get to the discussion. And let's just dive into the composition of the committees. Now that we have an overview of the players and their relative size. Here's the UCI's Management Committee. This is the main executive body that operates the UCI. Besides the obvious problem, you've probably noticed the gender imbalance. Only one of the 17 members is a woman. But there's also the problem, from our perspective, that athletes do not have any say whatsoever, any vote in the process to elect the members of the Management Committee. Only the UCI member federations select the members of the committee. Now, starting in 2016, one positive step forward, you could say, the president of the Athletes Commission, and we'll look at the Athletes Commission on the next slide, but the president of that commission was given a seat on the Management Committee, but this seat has no vote. It is observer status only. This is not an effective situation from the athlete's perspective because that representative is a volunteer. It's not a paid position. This person has no full-time support staff. The representative is typically a full-time athlete, or they're a very recently retired athlete who's left looking to support his family or her family in another way. In summary, the UCI Management Committee, which is the most powerful, is controlled completely by individuals from the National Federation community. Now, here's the Athletes Commission, the UCI Athletes Commission. It's 2 members, 1 man, 1 woman, from each of the 9 cycling disciplines. And establishing athletes commissions, it's a fashionable thing for federations and national Olympic committees to do. It gives the appearance of athletes having a voice in governance matters, but without truly being accountable to the athletes. The UCI Athletes Commission, from our perspective, is particularly ineffective for pro cycling, for men's pro cycling, and it's probably true for every other discipline, but I'm only speaking for men's pro cycling, that it's ineffective because, one, historically this commission itself only meets once per year. It meets in the off-season when riders are available, which is not nearly enough, not nearly often enough. to address the issues that arise on a daily basis during the racing season. Two, in this case, I'd say diversity is a weakness because a professional road cyclist can't count on a mountain biker or on a track cyclist to effectively understand and address the question of should we have 8 or 9 riders on a Tour de France team. In the same way that a road cyclist is not well suited to speak about what's best for the cyclocross calendar. And third, fundamentally, the body is a division of the governing body. What little authority and portfolio it does have is granted completely by the UCI's own regulations. And while it's unlikely, let's just say if this commission ever stood strongly in conflict with the UCI, the commission could be instantly dismantled with a stroke of the UCI Management Committee's pen. They have the power to do that. So the last committee, quick review, is the Pro Cycling Council, which oversees the administration of the Men's World Tour. And I think this is the best opportunity for change. There's 12 members of the Pro Cycling Council plus 1 president. The decisions of the PCC are taken by a simple majority vote, with the tiebreaker being cast by the president if necessary. Without much explanation, you can see that a big block of 5 members are appointed by the UCI Management Committee, and when you learn that, in fact, most of those are federation presidents, you can fill in the rest. I mean, look at the bottom half of the list, though. The Teams Association has 2 representatives, AOC has 2 members, but the CPA only appoints 1. The second riders rep is from the Athletes Commission. And I don't mean to suggest that Bernard Eisel is anything but wise and capable and extremely respected by everybody in the peloton, but the demands on the schedule of a professional athlete make it impossible to attend all of these PCC meetings, and this puts cyclists at a disadvantage when they're already disadvantaged, I think, with the composition. It's an absurd imbalance, and I think it ought to be addressed. When decisions are made without true and equitable participation from the athletes, it creates within the pro peloton a level of mistrust of the UCI, and it contributes to a more corrosive culture inside the sport. So the current deficit, I think, is a challenge and an opportunity for both the UCI and the CPA and the members of the pro peloton. One part of the movement for good governance is entrust athletes with a greater level of involvement in the governance of their sport. They have the most to lose when sports are run poorly. They lose when their teammates or their competitors cheat and steal their moments of achievement. They lose when they're injured because of a poorly designed or managed race course. In terms of both anti-corruption and economic measures, the most successful sports are those where the athletes are partners in governance. So in very general terms, the solution I propose is 2-part, and I'll leave most of this for the discussion, but 1, a stronger and more effective riders association, and that largely depends on the athletes. They have to make an increased investment into their organization. They have to bring on more staff, increase the activity, and just make it a more dynamic organization overall. And the second part is the other stakeholders engaging the athletes through that riders association with direct one-on-one negotiations where necessary, and then multi-party committees elsewhere. So thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Michael. So now I'd like to just invite Brian to perhaps reflect on a few of these comments and to tell us sort of his perspective on where the future of the sport is going. We know, Brian, that you have dedicated a good part of your life to this sport, and so I think we all thank you for that. And we're interested also to hear some of the ideas that you've been mentioning lately about possibly getting further involved in the sport with the women's team. So why don't you go ahead and take the floor and make a few comments, and then we'll turn it over to some questions and answers.
Sure. Thanks. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Well, if I can just comment on each of the speakers' contributions so far. I mean, I think the Rapha work is really, really interesting, and I guess I look forward to reading more about it when the publication comes off the presses, and I'm sure that's going to be absolutely fascinating. I think it's really interesting and probably a first for a manufacturer, a commercial concern, to show an interest in this way, and I welcome that. I think that's a good move forward. Let's see what the document says. In terms of the media contribution, I thought that was really, really interesting. I think the key phrase that leapt out for me was about trustworthy news sources. I think we are seeing an increase in untrustworthy news sources of one sort or another, thanks to social media, perhaps more correctly termed anti-social media in many cases. I think it's interesting to compare and contrast the proposals that you've come up with so far, Steve and Raymond, that I think go to the very heart of what is the problem for professional cycling, in that, on the one hand, many people feel that more control, more centralism, more structure, and thus more income is needed. But that, in a sense, absolutely is diametrically opposed to the concept and the history and heritage of free access to cycling. We, as consumers and fans of cycling, are used to consuming it for free. We like to go and watch it at the side of the road. We don't want to pay 10 euros or whatever for the privilege of watching it. But you can't consume any other sport in that way, really. And sooner or later, some of that is going to have to change. The moment that any cycling event goes onto a pay-to-view channel, then that's when the internet is full of people promoting pirate feeds and how you can circumvent all of these paywalls and all of the rest of it. But that's the basic problem, isn't it, at the root of the economy of professional cycling, that the only source of income, as others have mentioned already this morning, the only source of income is the sponsor with the name on the jersey. In most other sports, the teams have the income from ticket sales at the stadium, from television rights, from lots of other things, and really, as has been said, the only source of income for teams, and thus for the riders, the athletes, is the shirt sponsor, as it might be referred to in football. So I think that's interesting. I think the proposal for a department for pro cycling is interesting. I think UCI would probably say that the Professional Cycling Council is that, but it doesn't have representation from the media at the moment. I understand that the new president, David Lepatien, has established a commission on cycling's economy and marketing, and maybe that's something that can come up with some interesting results over and above the things that I was able to do during my 4 years as president. No doubt we'll touch on some of those issues in the rest of the discussion. The contribution from Michael on the CPA, I recognise many of the points that he's making, but I do think part of the problem in involving athletes in the governance of the sport is that they simply don't have the time or inclination to contribute in many occasions. So I think, Michael, certainly the CPA needs to be a much stronger and more effective body. I think that UCI would welcome that. I think it needs reform. I think it needs to be a much more powerful voice. It's interesting what you said about numbers of women involved, and I don't know whether CPA is thinking of involving women on an equal basis. Perhaps you should think about that. I think look, it's always easy to blame the governing body for things that aren't right, and that's fine. I think governing bodies, take that on the chin by and large. But I think, when you talk about the Athletes Commission, I think you use the word fashionable. it's not a fashion, Michael. It's a requirement of IOC. It's a requirement of most codes of good governance to involve the athletes in your sport all around the world at national governing body level, at continental governing body level, and so on. Involvement of athletes via an Athletes Commission is now a requirement, and whether one likes it or not, I think that's a good move forward. The reality is, again, I don't think you mentioned this on your slides, but each of the specialist commissions of the UCI has at least one athlete representative on it. So I think there is more involvement there than perhaps you gave UCI the credit for. I think, you know, when you just do a simple adding up of all of the amounts of cash that are involved, the financial and economic sides of things, well, by definition, industries are always going to be bigger than the body that's regulating that industry. That doesn't mean that the industry should overpower and control the regulator. On the contrary, I would suggest the alternative point of view is that the regulator should try to control the industry more effectively. And you know, if you see the UCI, the International Federation, as a regulator, well, what do regulators not like? They don't like monopolies or quasi-monopolies. What do monopolies not like? They don't like regulators. They want to have as big a monopoly and as greater control over their industry as they possibly can. You know, those of us who were in this room yesterday might remember an analogy of sausage makers. You know, if you don't have an independent regulator of your sausage-making industry, would you really want to eat the sausages that are provided to you without knowing what the ingredients are and so on? So I think it's a slightly jokey analogy, but I think let's think about what we want from our regulator in cycling, and I think it's very difficult to be the regulator in cycling when you are faced with, in effect, a quasi-monopoly that has the ability to overpower all the other players in the game. So that's a challenge for UCI. It was a challenge in my period as 4 years. It will be a challenge for the new president and his administration. I think those are the issues that are worth considering going forward. I think also I would say that in terms of looking at athlete representatives and current and past riders, it was difficult in my era to try to find ex-professional riders who didn't have some history, if I can put it as subtly as that. So we involved on the Professional Cycling Council Gilles de Leon and Charlie Motte, two riders who had a very decent and clean reputation. I hope that continues under the new president, and we can continue to rebuild the integrity of the sport, because the single biggest challenge to the economy of professional cycling was the integrity issue, the doping issue, and until that was cleaned up, which we took great steps to do, not just with the Cirque, but with establishing and completing the independence of the Cycling Anti-Doping Foundation, independent anti-doping tribunals, a separate legal anti-doping service and so on, making those things genuinely separate and genuinely independent from the governance of the UCI and from the management of the UCI. I think those things, that in particular, was a really, really crucial thing to lay a proper foundation for a strong development of the economy of professional cycling, from which many of these other desirable benefits that we've heard about in the last few minutes, from which they can be built, structured and developed for the future. So I don't think we need to be too gloomy. I think the future can look good for professional cycling. I think we have, I would suggest, immodestly, I think in that period when I was president, we did rebuild the integrity very much of the sport, and now the challenge is to take that forward. Still lots of work to do, of course there is, and always will be, but I think we are making good progress as a sport, and I think the potential that is there to make a lot further progress. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. So I think what we'd like to do is address any questions from the audience, and we got off to sort of a late start here, so I hope you don't mind if we go over for a few minutes towards lunch. But let's have a little bit of a discussion now. Yes, sir. We have a microphone.
Yeah, a question to Brian Cookson. I heard you mentioned pay TV. Do you think cycling, professional cycling, could survive on pay TV? I mean, having in mind that all the teams are sponsor teams, actually.
I think it's a big challenge because, as I say, traditionally, the fans of cycling have been used to consuming it for free, either at the side of the road or on their television sets. I guess the same questions were asked when football went largely to pay TV, and certainly in UK, the Premier League and so on. A lot of people said, "Oh, it'll be a disaster. It won't work. People just won't pay to watch. They won't pay substantial sums of money to watch football in their own living rooms." But they do, and we see what the economy of professional football has become. I don't necessarily think that's altogether healthy. I don't think professional cycling could or should go that far, but I do think if professional cycling organizes itself much more coherently and comprehensively, then there are possibilities of the consumers having to, and perhaps willingly, contributing financially to the sport. That's the bottom line, really, isn't it? That cycling is so weak financially because most consumers consume it for free.
So when we talk about the value proposition and how it's presented to the general public, we also have to start getting creative about what we're presenting and whether or not fans will pay for it. Well, and to that point, how it gets paid for. I think we haven't yet touched the digital platforms in a meaningful way, in a cohesive way. And what I mean that is, right now, as we heard from several folks on the panel, cycling is competing with search for advertising dollars. The difference is search knows more about our consumers of our sport than we do. And that's a losing proposition. The only way to get in on that game is to play that game to our benefit. And on a digital platform, whether we make it pay-per-view or premium or we make it free to view, if we tap into that community and we create the pull, not pushing out the ad, but pulling in the content to the consumer's current digital feeds, we create a different version of that model. The possibilities are there, but we're still very fixated on the television model, and as that gets more fractured, as we lose our fans as they get older and age out, it's tough. So it's not just the idea of, can we survive on pay-per-view? It's what does that model really look like, and are we having the right discussions and conversations to get there?
Yes, over here in front, please.
Hello, my name is Seda Reed, and I am here from Arizona State University in the United States. And I had a question for Raymond and Stephen. I was interested in your positive feedback model. Can you say a little bit about what the effect would be in that feedback loop when the media attention is negative, for example? Like if the media attention is bringing something negative about in the field.
But that is also... Do you hear me? Yeah. But this is also kind of the game. Negative effects also here with the sports. We have seen in the last years with all the doping scandals that also that gains a public. It was negative for cycling, but if you go back to the history, I read a book from Henry de Desgrange. He was the man who started the Tour de France in 1903. And after 2 or 3 years, they had really big problems with a lot of people who were against the Tour de France, who tried to stop the Tour de France. And Desgrange said, this is perfect for us, because only scandals can make our sport bigger. And that is also something to think sometimes about, that when there happens something, if you have good quality journalism about what's happening, that also attracts the sport.
I'd just like to say, perhaps in the short term, the headlines or the news is seen as something negative because it creates a short-term damage. But what would cycling be like if it didn't have the journalism, the investigative journalism that it's had in the last 20 years, if we didn't go through the scandals? Lance Armstrong probably would still have 7 Tour de France victories on his wall at home. He could have an important role in the sport now. Now he's not involved, and that was a clear message, I think, to other dopers as well.
Yeah, and also when you look to now the Hajo Seppelt, what he did in athleticism, I think when you look in 5 to 10 years, he helped the sport. But what would happen if there was not good journalism in the last 20 years when we had the doping scandals? Then we only had the propaganda of the teams. And would the public accept that? That's also a question.
Yes, sir. In the back.
Hello, my name is Frank Quante. I represent Delta Cycling Rotterdam. We have a continental team and we invest in grassroots cycling, but also cycling as a way of mobility. So I like the work the UCI started with Cycling for All, since it's cycling is way more than a sport with a back number. I have 2 questions for Mr. Cookson. One is, do you believe from the current circuit with the Europe Tour and the World Tour and the teams that there are enough criteria for teams and organizers to become part of this tour or competition, since there's a lot of, the quality is pretty diverse, let me put it that way. And secondly, do you believe less is more, because we've seen the World Tour grow, but isn't it better to grow like the best project as a best practice? And do you believe that less is more, or is this the way to go to extend the World Tour with races nobody watches, to give it a frame?
Well, you won't be surprised that I'm going to defend the World Tour as it is. I think it is still, however, a work in progress. I think that the World Tour previously, and before that it was known as the Pro Tour, was essentially a European and shrinking competition calendar, whatever you want to call it. I think what I inherited in 2013 were proposals to make it even smaller, to reduce the number of racing days in the World Tour, and thus reduce the length of certain events. The messages that I got from organisers, teams, and others was that was not going to be acceptable. So what I did with my colleagues was to revisit the whole process, reconsult all of the different stakeholders, and that was when the interesting discussions began, because there is a complete imbalance in the power of the stakeholders in cycling, certainly in men's professional cycling. So, however, what we were able to do was to identify some opportunities for making the World Tour a genuinely global series, which I think for the economy of professional cycling to grow, that has to happen. You cannot have a genuine World Series that does not visit places like North America, United States, that does not visit Asia, China or the Gulf. And so we found a number of possibilities of doing that to fill in some of the gaps. We proposed levels of flexibility to allow the teams to participate in that without overloading them too much. And I think this last year has been a success. I think if you want to talk about the different levels, then I think that the European Tour and the other continental tours have been challenged in some cases. In other cases, they're expanding and doing quite well. But I don't think that where they are challenged, it's because of the strength of the World Tour. I think it's because of local difficulties, economic difficulties, organizational difficulties in certain of those countries that have been the traditional heartland of professional cycling. And I think some of those events would have disappeared with or without an expansion in the World Tour. So I'm quite defensive of that, and I make no apologies for that. I think if you look at one or two events, and you know, I think that some of them have been slightly less successful than others. I think, you know, if you take the Tour of Turkey, for instance, I think that was probably a little bit ahead of its time to put it into the World Tour, but a couple of years ago, everyone was talking about what a success the Tour of Turkey was, and then the political situation has changed, and by the time it came to take place this year, you know, it was perhaps more challenging for the teams to take part, but the organisation standard apparently was good. The Tour of Guangxi in China was, I believe, a big success. I believe that there were plenty of people watching. I think the television coverage needs, obviously, greater investment and so on, but absolutely, to expand the economy of professional cycling, to make it more, to make it stronger and more sustainable, cycling has to be in China, and it has to have partners like Wanda Group, the biggest leisure company in the world now. And I think part of the future is that the World Tour will continue to go to events and places like that. I think that's an absolutely vital part of what we're doing. So, you know, I'm seeing now, you know, the new president of the UCI has got his own ideas and ambitions, and I wish him good luck with that. And I noticed that one of them is to suggest that perhaps the Giro and the Vuelta could go down to 2 weeks. I think that's perhaps something that is worthy of discussion. I have to say that when I proposed that, I got a shitty legal letter from ASO saying that I was damaging the economic interests of the Vuelta by suggesting such a thing. So, you know, I hope that David doesn't get that kind of response to what I think is a rational debate that needs to be had. I do think probably it would be better if stage races were shorter than they are at the moment. I mean, to be honest, if you were inventing pro cycling today, you wouldn't have 3-week tours. You wouldn't have 260 or 280 kilometer one-day races. You would have a format that was much more consumable and much more understandable, comprehensible to the public. I think cycling is going that way. There are a number of people trying experiments and so on that have worked, I think, in the past couple of years, some that haven't worked. I mean, I think the Hammer series, for instance, the Velon group has been an interesting idea. I don't think the execution of that was really good. I think it was too complicated, but you know, that's another story. I think we are in a transitional phase. As I said, I think the World Tour is still a work in progress. I'm interested to see the way the new administration and new president, David Lepartien, takes it. Let's see what happens, but clearly what's interesting and what's worthwhile is this kind of dialogue and debate. And as I say, I look forward to the contribution from Rafa, from the media, and from the riders and other organizations. We don't have anyone from the event organizers here or anyone from the teams organization here. I'm sure they would have very interesting inputs into our discussion.
In front here.
Hello, my name is David Naert. I work for VRT, the Flemish public broadcaster, very keen on cycling. I'm also the chair of the Radio Sport Group of the European Broadcasting Union, and I would just like to share a few observations because many of our radio members are very keen on cycling, love to report on the cycling events. Brian, you mentioned the input of Wanda, the owner of Infront, which for a while was the rights holder of the UCI World Championships. That's a group that charges access fees to mixed zones, to non-rights holders in cycling and volleyball, non-acceptable practices. Secondly, what strikes me in cycling is the short-term vision of many of the organizers. And again, we have to go back to Italy, When Raymond gave his presentation, he mentioned that Eurosport is now the rights holder, for instance, for the Giro d'Italia. IMG was the company that acquired the rights for the Giro d'Italia, also Milan-San Remo. And a couple of years ago, Bradley Wiggins took part in the Giro d'Italia, and it created a huge interest in the United Kingdom. Cycling was not as popular then in the UK as it is right now. So the BBC Radio 5 Live went on site, day in, day out, covered the Giro d'Italia. In the end, they ended up paying 3 times as much as what they pay for covering the Tour de France, which is really the prime event. The result is BBC Radio will never ever come back to the Giro d'Italia. There goes your audience, there goes your new market, there go your new fans for the Giro d'Italia. And I just cannot understand why people with so much experience in such a grand sport would opt for short-term gains instead of thinking about the long-term picture.
You respond to that?
Well, the quick response to that is because all of those people have blinkers. They look at all of those situations just from their own particular point of view and resist any comprehensive overview of issues like that. So, and they resist the UCI getting involved to try to tell them what to do in terms of rights and broadcast coverage and so on.
So there's also another part of that question, which is why haven't we created a model that encourages long-term thinking in terms of the media rights? And again, it goes back to how we're looking at the media rights in a modern context. A lot of these decisions, a lot of these strategies are based on a way of thinking that people are used to. But the digital media landscape has changed that because our methods of consuming media and being exposed to media and becoming emotionally connected to the content and the action and the context of the content, it's all changed. And we need to start looking at that and maybe creating the carrot and put it on a stick and lead them forward to a different pathway. We can create the carrot, but who has the stick? Who's willing to take the first step forward to reform that or to create the incentives? And I think more to your point, yeah, cycling has a really rich history of pissing off its sponsors and its investors. It just does that because of how it's been operated in the past at a business level. But perhaps this is one of those instances where people within the sport are taking a first step. No one wants to do that, and yet everyone at this table is doing that now because it's becoming more and more critical as, again, the sport's viewership becomes older, as the sponsors become less inclined to make a push to get advertising out versus pay for the right to have it pulled into the content feeds of the everyday browser on the internet. We have to think differently, and that's why we're here.
Yeah, I just want to react. Mr. Cookson said one of the solutions could be pay-per-view, but I don't believe in that because the main source of money is coming from title sponsors. Those sponsors of the teams need to generate as much as publicity as they can. If we go to pay-per-view, we go to a smaller public. We have to ask, is cycling big enough to gain a big audience by pay-per-view? I think that we come back to our story, what Stephen and I told. Then you are selling stories to insiders. Insiders are selling stories to insiders. So I don't think that pay-per-view is a solution for cycling. Otherwise, if you see the evolution in cycling, on an economical way, cycling really has a huge problem for the next years. I'm absolutely sure about it.
I'd add to that as well that I don't think that it's a false dichotomy between pay-per-view and just free broadcasting. The reality of most digital subscription models now is that they're tiered anyway. And so there's no reason why we have to restrict a certain offering within the sport, and it would be harmful to do that. So if they can come up with a model that broadcasts live sport for free online and then has a tiered subscription model, which is, for example, access to backstage areas, access to exclusive rider interviews, access to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many different content streams within the sport that there's a hybrid between these two that creates a revenue stream for media companies as well as the teams and athletes, and also doesn't restrict the audience that you're going to. I just think it's an out of date discussion, pay-per-view versus free media. There's a middle ground.
So I think in the interests of allowing everybody to have time for a bite of lunch, we'll kind of bring this to a close. I'd just like to ask my colleague Joe to make a few closing comments, and then we'll head to lunch.
So again, I'd like to thank all the panelists and for the contributions. This is the start of a dialogue. I think we can't live in a vacuum within the sport of cycling any longer. As many of the panelists have said, and what we've shared in the past on the outer line is that the sport is gravitating inwards, and it's insiders selling the sport to insiders. We're talking to our fans, and we're missing the opportunities to reach across the table and talk to a wider public, not just from the aspect of a vendor, which has an artificial ceiling, because the sport simply will not expand and get new people involved and expand the market to potentially one day fall in love with the sport enough that the product becomes an emotional connection to the sport. And to the journalists who need to have those opportunities to reach the wider public, tell those stories. Investment journalism, which brings the sport closer to people and creates those connections. To the athletes themselves, who are demanding change in a variety of ways, they can be a driver just as they have been in other sports, in leagues and in individual competitions, but they are the product. There's no race without its athletes, and that voice needs to be heard. And we also need to respect the experience and wisdom of those who bore the mantle of trying to guide this sport before us. There is tremendous value in that knowledge, whether it has been from our past National Federation presidents or past presidents of the UCI like Pat McQuaid and Brian Cookson here with us today. Let us keep the dialogue going forward. This is one conversation of many, and we hope to foster this environment in the future. We all play a part in it for the good of our sport, and we look forward to hearing the comments, hearing new ideas, and exploring them together and make cycling, as James has mentioned many times, and what brought us all together on this project to begin with, make it the biggest and greatest sport in the world. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Join me in thanking the panel, please. Thank you.